Welcome back, everyone, for our fourth deep dive now, and this time it's about the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs,
The ministry.
which is part of our series on diplomacy and international relations.
Yeah.
With me, Bastian Freiborg, and just a quick reminder that this deep dive is
Yeah.
AI-generated, but it is fact-checked.
Fact-checked. Very important.
Right. Very, very important.
So you can be sure that what you're hearing is accurate
It is.
and insightful.
Yes, it is.
We're taking a closer look today
Uh-huh.
at the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You sent me a fascinating collection of reports and analyses and historical documents even. And it really seems like this ministry is kind of a chameleon.
It is.
Always changing.
Yeah.
But kind of grappling with surprisingly similar challenges
Yeah.
throughout its history.
You know, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is this idea of like a 100-year conversation going on within Danish foreign policy.
Okay, 100-year conversation. What do you
Yeah.
mean by that? So, when you look at reports from Danish foreign policy commissions over the past century,
Mm-hmm.
you see some striking parallels in the issues they're raising
Mm-hmm.
and the solutions that they're proposing. And there's this report from 1921,
Wow, really a century ago?
a century ago, and it echoes so many of the debates that we're having today.
It does.
Yeah.
So what
Yeah.
kind of issues are we talking about here?
Yeah.
Give me an example.
The tension between prioritizing political diplomacy versus economic diplomacy.
Okay.
That's been a recurring theme within the ministry structure for decades. And the 1921 report grapples with this very question.
Uh-huh.
How much should Denmark focus on traditional diplomacy versus promoting trade and economic interests abroad?
Yeah, that sounds very familiar.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that play out right now with Denmark's role in the green energy transition.
Right.
Some are arguing that we should leverage our expertise in that area
Mm-hmm.
to forge stronger political alliances. Others are saying, no, we need to focus on securing a dominant position in the global green tech market.
Right. Yeah.
It's like this tension that is woven
Yeah.
into the fabric of Danish foreign policy.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it speaks to the challenges of being a small state,
Yeah.
like Denmark trying to have influence on the world stage. You have limited resources, so you have to be very strategic about how you deploy them. Do you prioritize political influence or economic gain? And how do you strike that balance?
Right.
These are questions that have preoccupied Danish diplomats for generations.
Yeah, it does seem like these shifting priorities also have an impact on how the ministry itself is structured.
They do.
You mentioned that for much of the 20th century, the ministry was organized around function.
Right.
So you had separate political and economic departments. And then in the 1990s, they shift to a more geographical approach with those north-south groups.
Yeah, the ministry is constantly adapting, to the changing global landscape and the internal priorities. It's a bit like trying to hit a moving target.
Right.
And each structure comes with, benefits and drawbacks.
Right.
The functional division allowed for deep expertise within areas, but it could also lead to a lack of coordination. The territorial structure was meant to improve regional focus, but sometimes, it creates silos between different parts of the world.
Yeah.
So, swings and roundabouts.
And now we have this current center-based model, right?
They do.
Where they're trying to kind of bring everything together under a more unified approach.
Exactly. And there's a real emphasis on coherence, coordination, complementarity. You could say it's a reflection of this broader trend towards new public governance, or NPG.
NPG, so that's kind of like shifting away from like a government that's working in silos to a more integrated approach.
Yeah.
Where different agencies are collaborating.
Yeah.
More like imagine like how the different departments in a company have to work together, to launch a product.
Yeah.
You got marketing, sales, engineering. Everyone's got to be on the same page.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It captures the essence of NPG.
Yeah.
But as you can imagine, putting it into practice is often easier said than done.
Yeah. And it seems like the ministry is facing a pretty significant hurdle in actually trying to achieve this 3C ideal. And that's budget cuts.
Yeah.
I mean, I read that the ministry's budget has actually decreased significantly
It has.
over the past decade, even as demands for a more active Danish presence on the world stage are increasing.
It's a paradox, isn't it?
It is.
The ministry's budget decreased by 33%
Wow.
between 2002 and 2013.
That's huge.
It is, and the pressure to do more with less
Yeah.
has only intensified since then.
Yeah. And, some of the reports even mention former foreign ministers
Yeah.
expressing alarm about what they call the bleeding service
Mm-hmm.
and arguing that these continuous cuts are really undermining the ministry's ability to respond effectively to global crises and even provide basic consular services for Danish citizens abroad.
I mean, their concerns are valid.
Yeah.
And it all feeds into this larger paradox of Danish diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, you have this ministry that's constantly adapting, restructuring, trying to do more with less.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you have this perception of Danish diplomacy as being somewhat underwhelming.
Underwhelming, really.
Yeah.
But Denmark has a reputation for being, a strong advocate for human rights, a leader in development aid, a champion of multilateralism.
That's true. And those are all important achievements.
Yeah.
But when you look at the media coverage, it's often negative.
Really?
Yeah, there's a perception that Danish diplomacy lacks teeth.
Okay.
That it's too focused on consensus building and not assertive enough in promoting national interests.
It's interesting, though, because the reports also mention that despite this negative press coverage, the ministry consistently ranks really high.
It does.
In public opinion polls when it comes to trustworthiness and desirability as a workplace.
Yeah.
So people seem to respect the work that diplomats do.
They do. It's fascinating. You have this gap between public perception and the reality.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to one of the core challenges of diplomacy, the need for secrecy.
Right, because so much of what diplomats do happens behind closed doors in those confidential negotiations.
Exactly.
And it's not the kind of work that lends itself to,
No.
flashy headlines.
No, it's not.
Or, easy PR wins.
Exactly. So that creates a sense of mystery and sometimes even suspicion about the ministry's activities.
Right.
But at the same time, there's a growing demand for transparency in government, for greater public engagement in foreign policy. So it's this real balancing act for the ministry.
Yeah. How do you reconcile the need for secrecy with the desire for openness?
Yeah. But isn't there also the risk that too much transparency could actually hinder effective negotiations?
There is.
If every conversation is out in the open, wouldn't that make it harder to find compromises and reach agreements?
Potentially, yes. And that's something that diplomats wrestle with all the time. They have to weigh the benefits against the risks.
Right.
And sometimes a little bit of secrecy is necessary to allow parties to kind of speak freely, explore different options without the fear of public backlash. But too much secrecy can breed mistrust and undermine public support.
So it's a delicate dance.
It is.
Figuring out how much to reveal and when.
Absolutely. And
speaking of balancing acts, this whole idea of diplomats needing to be both generalists and specialists, I find that fascinating.
Yeah.
How can someone be an expert on everything?
Right.
From trade negotiations to climate change to human rights.
Right.
It seems like an impossible task. It's a tall order, but it is one of the things that makes diplomacy such a unique profession.
Right.
On the one hand, you need to have a broad understanding of global affairs, be able to adapt to different cultures, political systems, and you have to be comfortable dealing with a wide range of issues.
Right.
But you also need to have deep expertise in specific areas to be effective.
So it's like almost being a chameleon, blending in while standing out.
I like that analogy. It captures the duality of the role.
Yeah, and this leads us to another interesting aspect of the ministry's work, and that's this dual role as both gatekeepers and what you call meta-coordinator of Danish foreign policy.
Right.
So break that down for me.
Okay.
What do you mean by those terms?
So as gatekeepers, the ministry acts as the official voice of Danish foreign policy. They're the ones communicating Denmark's position to the world, negotiating treaties, representing Denmark in international organizations.
So they're kind of like the guardians of Denmark's image and interests on the world stage.
Right.
What about the meta-coordinator part?
Well, this is where things get a little bit more complex because the ministry is also tasked with coordinating international activities across all government sectors. So it's not just about what the ministry itself does. It's about ensuring that all the different ministries and agencies involved in international affairs are working together in a coherent and strategic way.
So they're not just representing Denmark to the world. They're also coordinating Denmark's internal efforts to engage with the world.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
That sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is.
Especially given all the different actors and interests involved.
Right.
And then you add this final layer of paradox, this tension between national interests and global values.
Yeah.
How do you balance pursuing Denmark's specific national interests with the need to articulate foreign policy in terms of broader global values and humanitarian concerns, especially in areas like development aid, where Denmark has this long tradition of being generous and principled?
Yeah, it's a constant juggling act and something that, diplomats are navigating all the time. On the one hand, you have to be pragmatic and advocate for what's best for Denmark, but you also have to be mindful of Denmark's reputation as a responsible global citizen, as a country that upholds human rights and contributes to the greater good.
It's like threading a needle with a moving target. You have to be strategic. You have to be idealistic. You have to be assertive and collaborative all at the same time.
All at the same time. And to add another layer of complexity, we need to debunk this unity myth that sometimes surrounds the ministry.
What do you mean by unity myth?
Well, there's this idea that the ministry operates as a unified front, everyone marching in lockstep. But the reality is much more nuanced. Because the ministry is composed of diverse actors and interests. You have multiple ministers, each with their own priorities and constituencies. You have different departments, each with their own distinct culture, way of doing things. For instance, the development aid department might have a very different approach than the department focused on trade negotiations. And then you have a large number of locally hired staff at embassies worldwide who bring their own perspectives and experiences to the table.
So it's more of a mosaic than a monolith.
Exactly. And this internal diversity can sometimes lead to friction, competing priorities, different interpretations of what constitutes Danish national interest.
I imagine that navigating those internal tensions can be just as challenging as dealing with the complexities of the external world.
It can be.
It's like you're managing a miniature United Nations within the ministry itself.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
And all of this internal complexity is playing out against the backdrop of a rapidly changing landscape for diplomacy as a whole.
It is.
We're seeing diplomacy happening outside the traditional confines of the ministry in a few key ways. So give me some examples. What kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, one of the biggest shifts is what we call sectorization. But essentially, other ministries and government agencies are developing their own international capacities. So you have a more fragmented and sector-specific approach to foreign policy. For instance, a lot of EU policy coordination now happens outside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yeah, it happens within the relevant ministry.
So like the Ministry of Finance or Environment.
Exactly.
So diplomacy is no longer the exclusive domain of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
That's right. Other actors are getting involved.
And then there's also the rise of privatization in diplomacy.
There is. We're seeing private companies, NGOs, civil society organizations taking on roles traditionally associated with diplomacy. They're engaging directly with foreign governments, international bodies, sometimes even acting as like intermediaries or facilitators.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Think about humanitarian aid organizations like the Danish Refugee Council. They operate in conflict zones around the world. They're negotiating access for aid deliveries. Providing humanitarian assistance, even engaging in peace-building efforts.
Wow.
So in some ways, they're performing functions that were once solely the domain of diplomats.
So the lines are getting blurred.
They are.
Between traditional diplomacy and the work of these non-state actors.
They are.
What else is changing?
Well, another big shift is the rise of summit diplomacy. It seems like these days, international relations are increasingly conducted through high-level summit meetings, direct engagement between heads of state.
Right, all the G7 summits, summits.
Exactly, all these different regional forums.
It's true. It feels like every week there's another summit happening somewhere.
There is.
But what does that have to do with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs?
Well, this shift towards summit diplomacy places a significant burden on the Prime Minister's office.
Right.
Because they now require specialized expertise to manage all these high-level engagements.
Right, so they need people who understand the nuances of protocol.
Exactly.
How to prepare briefing materials, advise the Prime Minister on, how to navigate these complex diplomatic events.
Yeah.
So it's like a whole new branch of diplomacy is emerging.
Yeah.
It's focused on supporting the Prime Minister in these high-stakes international encounters.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have sectorization, privatization summit, diplomacy, all reshaping the landscape of diplomacy. Anything else?
One more, and that's supranationalization, particularly the growing role of the EU in foreign policy. The EU now has its own diplomatic service, the European External Action Service, and a network of delegations around the world. So this means that a lot of the foreign policy decisions that were once made at the national level are now being made at the EU level.
Right. So Denmark's foreign policy is increasingly being shaped by decisions made in Brussels.
That's right. And this creates...
Yeah, that must create some interesting tensions.
It does. Yeah, you have this constant interplay between national diplomacy and supranational diplomacy, which can create friction.
You know, Denmark might have a particular stance on an issue, but that stance might not be aligned with the EU's position.
Right.
So there's this constant negotiation and compromise happening between those national and supranational interests.
It sounds like Danish diplomats have their work cut out for them trying to navigate all these complexities and competing priorities.
Yeah.
But, you know, despite all these challenges, there's still a sense that diplomacy, you know, this face-to-face interaction, this building of relationships is more important than ever.
It is.
In today's world.
Yeah, and I think it's important to go beyond the headlines, to look past the narrative about the decline of diplomacy and to appreciate the unique value that the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs brings to the table.
Okay, so tell me, what are we missing when we focus on those headlines? About the decline of diplomacy? What's the real story here?
Well, first and foremost, knowledge is power. In a world that is overflowing with information, it's more important than ever to have reliable sources of information. People who can cut through the noise and provide accurate, insightful analysis. And that's exactly what the ministry does.
They're the eyes and ears of the Danish government on the world stage.
Exactly. They have diplomats stationed all over the globe, gathering information, building relationships, providing expert analysis of global trends.
And not just reacting to events as they unfold, but trying to anticipate what's coming next.
Right. They're trying to be proactive, to identify challenges and opportunities before they become full-blown crises or missed opportunities. And they're doing all this while navigating these internal paradoxes we talked about, managing shrinking budgets, adapting to a world where diplomacy is no longer confined to the halls of government.
Yeah, it's a tall order.
It makes you wonder, what does the future hold for the ministry? Can they continue to punch above their weight?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that the core functions of diplomacy, representation, negotiation, information gathering, and analysis, those will always be relevant, no matter how the world changes.
So while the methods and the players might evolve, the underlying need for diplomacy won't go away.
It won't, because diplomacy at its heart is about building and managing relationships between states. It's about finding ways to cooperate even when there are disagreements. And that's always going to be necessary, even in an increasingly interconnected and complex world.
So the ministry will need to adapt to become even more flexible and strategic in how it deploys its resources.
I think that's essential. And I'd add that they also need to get better at telling their own story.
Oh, that's interesting.
You know, at highlighting their successes and the value that they bring to the table.
Yeah, because I think there's often this disconnect between the public perception of diplomacy
There is.
as this kind of, stuffy elitist world and the reality of what diplomats do on a day-to-day basis.
People need to understand that diplomacy isn't just about governments talking to governments. It's about connecting with people, building relationships, fostering understanding across borders.
Yeah, it's not just about signing treaties.
It's not. It's about building trust, finding common ground, working towards shared goals.
Right. And those are the things that ultimately contribute to a more stable and prosperous world.
Exactly.
So even though the landscape of diplomacy is changing and the challenges are significant, I have a feeling the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs will continue to play a vital role.
I tend to agree.
Yeah, they've shown this impressive ability to adapt.
They have.
And innovate throughout their history.
They have.
And who knows, maybe someday those negative headlines will be replaced by stories of their quiet triumphs.
That would be great.
It would be a fitting recognition of their hard work and dedication.
Absolutely.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up.
Okay.
Part 1 of our deep dive.
Right.
I'm looking forward to our final part.
Me too.
Where we can really delve deeper into some of the specific questions that this research has raised.
Sounds good.
All right, see you then.
See you then. It is a tough one.
Yeah.
But I think if I had to pick one, I'd say the most crucial role for diplomats in this century is to be knowledge brokers.
Knowledge brokers. I like that.
Yeah.
Tell me more about what you mean.
Well, we live in a world that's just awash in information.
Right.
And much of it is contradictory, unreliable.
Right.
It's overwhelming, even for experts and diplomats, with their access to, on-the-ground intelligence.
Their networks of contacts, their training and analysis are really uniquely positioned to sift through all that noise and provide policymakers with accurate, insightful, and actionable information.
So they're not just passively collecting information. They're actively shaping how that information is interpreted and used. They're the sense makers, the storytellers, the ones who are helping us understand what's really happening.
Exactly. Yeah. And it connects to something else we touched upon earlier, this idea of the ministry as a kind of early warning system.
Right.
They're out there on the front line, so to speak, observing trends, picking up signals that others might miss, and anticipating how those developments might impact Danish interests.
So they're not just reacting to events as they unfold. No. They're trying to get ahead of the curve, predict what's coming next, so Denmark can be prepared. Exactly. And they're doing all of this while navigating those internal paradoxes we talked about.
Right.
Managing shrinking budgets, adapting to a world where diplomacy is no longer confined to the halls of government.
Right. It's a tall order.
It is a tall order.
It makes you wonder, what does the future hold for the ministry?
Right.
Can they continue to punch above their weight?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Given all these challenges. But I think it's important to remember that those core functions of diplomacy, representation negotiation, information gathering, analysis, those will always be relevant no matter how the world changes.
So while the methods and the players might evolve, the underlying need for diplomacy won't go away.
It won't, because diplomacy at its heart is about building and managing relationships between states. It's about finding ways to cooperate even when there are disagreements.
Right.
And that's always going to be necessary, even in an increasingly interconnected and complex world.
So the ministry will need to adapt, become even more flexible and strategic in how it deploys its resources.
I think that's essential. And I also think they need to get better at telling their own story.
Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, highlighting their successes and the value that they bring to the table.
Because I think there's often this disconnect between the public's perception of diplomacy as this kind of stuffy, elitist world and the reality of what diplomats do every day.
Right. There is a disconnect there. And I think people need to understand that diplomacy isn't just about governments talking to governments. It's about connecting with people, building relationships, fostering understanding across borders.
Yeah, it's not just about signing treaties.
No, it's about, building trust, finding common ground, working towards shared goals.
Right. And those are the things that ultimately contribute to a more stable and prosperous world. So even though the landscape of diplomacy is changing, and the challenges are really significant,
They are.
I have a feeling that the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs will continue to play a vital role.
I tend to agree they've shown this impressive ability to adapt and innovate throughout their history.
And who knows, maybe someday those negative headlines will be replaced by stories of their quiet triumphs.
I hope so.
That would be a fitting recognition of their hard work and dedication.
It would.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up part 2 of our deep dive.
Okay.
I'm looking forward to our final part, where we can delve deeper into some of the specific questions this research has raised. All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah.
This has been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has.
The more we kind of dig into this, the more I realize just how much is going on behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes, yeah. It's a world that most people don't really get a glimpse into, but it's absolutely crucial to understanding how Denmark interacts with the rest of the world.
Right.
And shapes its place on, the global stage.
Speaking of glimpses, one thing that really stuck with me from the research was this discussion about Indberetninger.
Ah, yes, the famous reports that diplomats send back from their posts.
Right. For those of us not fluent in Danish, could you explain what these reports are?
Of course.
And why they're so important?
So, Indberetningers are essentially reports from Danish diplomats stationed all over the world, and they provide firsthand insights into political, economic, and social developments in their respective countries.
So they're like the eyes and ears of the Danish government.
Yeah, keeping them informed about what's happening on the ground.
And it sounds like the nature of these reports has evolved over time.
It has in the past. They were much more focused on gathering basic facts and figures. But with the advent of the internet, and the easy availability of information online, the focus has shifted. Diplomats are expected to provide more analysis and context, connect the dots, and explain how global events might impact.
Right, so it's less about reporting what happened.
Exactly.
And more about providing that insightful interpretation.
Exactly. Offering that. So what factor?
Right.
Yeah. Diplomats are now expected to be expert interpreters of events, identifying trends, potential implications for Denmark. They need to be able to see the bigger picture, anticipate how things might play out, and advise policymakers accordingly.
That brings us to another key function of the ministry, and that is tilstedeværelse.
Ah, yes, presence.
Presence. Can you explain what this means in the context of Danish diplomacy?
So tilstedeværelse is about more than just having embassies scattered around the globe.
Right.
It's about actively cultivating relationships, building networks, being a reliable and engaged partner on the world stage. It's about, showing up, being present, demonstrating that Denmark is a serious player
in international affairs.
So it's about building trust and understanding, showing that Denmark is committed to engaging with the world, contributing to global solutions.
Precisely. And, maintaining that presence requires a lot of behind-the-scenes work from the ministry.
Right.
Think about it. You have diplomats, constantly rotating between posts, embassy buildings to manage security concerns, to address families to support. It's a complex logistical operation.
It's a massive undertaking, and one that must be even more challenging given the budget constraints that we discussed earlier. How do they prioritize where to focus their limited resources?
Well, it's a constant balancing act. They have to weigh the needs of Danish citizens abroad, the demands of, various sectors, the strategic objectives of the government. They have to make tough choices about, where to invest and where to perhaps scale back a little bit. And through it all, they have to uphold Danish values and promote a positive image of Denmark in the world.
It's a complex and demanding mission, no doubt, but one that's, absolutely essential in today's interconnected world.
Well, this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexities of Danish diplomacy.
Yeah.
It's left me with a lot to think about.
Me too. And it's a reminder that diplomacy is an ongoing process, a constant conversation, and a vital tool for navigating the challenges of the 21st century.
And hopefully we've given you, our listener, a better understanding of the work that goes into representing Denmark on the world stage. Don't forget to check out the show notes for links and resources if you'd like to explore this topic further. Until next time.